So I do want to kind of throw out some evocative images that we can think with for the next couple of days, and this is also a partial lead into, Michelle, your following session. I do talk about the exponential age. That's not a throwaway line. The exponential age provides us with tremendous opportunity, but tremendous social, institutional challenges. And we should understand both sides of this equation. And you'll see this come out a little bit as I go on. But I think all of us in this room can appreciate this preamble by John Maynard Keynes. The real difficulty in changing any enterprise lies not in developing new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. And I think most of our lives here have to do with as much that as creating something new, especially this crowd. So what is our current context and how do we build from it? Again, this is not a real throwaway line, but a lot of us look at this thing of this exponential age as a real shift from the S-curve world in which there was moments of brief, punctuated, violent evolution, and then 60, 70, 80 years of stability in time for us to reinvent social practices, learning practices, institutional architectures, and so on and so forth. And that has dominated for the last 300 years. There's some beautiful economic theses written about this, blah, blah, blah. Today's age, we have now sequences of rapid punctuated evolutions. I think these are lasting about 18 months. That brings out tremendous opportunity and tremendous institutional challenges. I'm also fond to quote two people, David Weinberg, too big to know. We used to know how to know. We got our answers from books and reports, blah, blah, blah. We nailed down. We even had canons. I'll come back to that. Today, in the internet age, knowledge has moved onto the networks. There's more knowledge than ever, but it's different. Topics have no boundaries, and nobody agrees on anything. And Carla Hesse, professor of history at Berkeley, all we have today is only paths of inquiry, modes of integration, and moments of encounter. This does really reflect two radically different states of being. And I like to capture that in terms of the fact that in this exponential age, we probably are moving into an era in which the half-life of most of our skills is shrinking to about 5 years. That is a tremendous challenge for formal schooling. By the way, it creates tremendous opportunities for community libraries because they can fill in, ... But to me, it's a huge shift from looking at stocks of knowledge. We know a lot about how to protect and deliver those authoritative knowledge. As we said earlier, we have fixed genres, blah, blah, blah. Today, we're moving into a new world where basically it's a world of flows. And the real catch is, how do you participate in flows? The catch here is in participating in the flow, most of what you create is tacit. We do not know how to capture tacit knowledge very effectively. And so we got already a fairly interesting epistemological challenge here. But on top of that, we have our genres are fluid. That means we no longer can count on institutional warrants, like how I grew up. I can't say, well, this appeared in this journal, therefore I necessarily believe it. That is even beginning to change, or the New York Times, depending what political bent you are, blah, blah, blah. But this whole notion that institutional warrants are becoming less relevant than ever. That's kind of a shocking idea. Various foundations are thinking about directly attacking that problem. But if you really think about it, I think most of us today are embedded in vast networks, all interlocking networks. It's very hard to figure out what the hell is really going on. And what do I want to believe and what do I not want to believe? I'll come back to that. Our vision of libraries is itself in a state of flux. But I'm going to argue, although our vision is maybe in flux, our priorities and the values are actually stable, as Charlie said, as Walter said last night. Picking off of the report, 3 priorities I think stay in place. Library is a hub of a community, getting back to Walter, make the most out of digital technologies and creative media, and mentoring, connecting, guiding, and curating are major kind of roles of the social spaces that we come together. How I grew up, many of us here, the traditional, I'm going to call it the core epistemology, based on Homo sapien, man who knows. We went to libraries, the definitive resource for figuring out what should we know. What's been happening more recently is we've been extending this traditional epistemology to a blended epistemology, and almost everyone in this room has been engaged in one form or another of a blended epistemology. The simplest one is how do we now blend Homo sapien, man who knows, with Homo faber, man who makes. And we make things, and we make content, and so on and so forth. And obviously, the maker movement and beyond is a simple example of this step toward a blended epistemology. But we all see images of these things. We could spend hours talking about fantastic examples of this. I want to shift focus slightly and say, well, there's another more subtle extension of this blend. Yes, we know a lot about man as maker, but today, with our exponential network technologies, we build contexts as much as content. And so think about how do we make context today. What is, of course, blogging about? What is Remix about? All these things are actually changing the context around content. By the way, if I can change the music to a video, I will completely transform what you think that video is about. And in fact, the sound often dictates what you see. Famous example, Jurassic Park. We all remember that dramatic scene where the dinosaur picks up the guy, picks him up and chumps him. Go back and do a still frame analysis of that. It ain't there. The sound was there, fed into our imagination, we filled it in. It's one of the reasons why we can't forget it. Our imagination was evoked to fill it in. Very clever ways of how, by architecting context, you can do amazing things. By the way, this has an awful lot to do with propaganda moves as well. One of the reasons why we now study how do we shape context in all kinds of ways. And in fact, I'm going to argue that in today's world, given the fact that warrants are fluid at best, without classical, stable institutional warrants, maybe reading context today is important as reading content. Many of us have not been trained to read context. Today's kids, they don't believe anything they read. What do is they triangulate on contexts, try to triangulate those contexts to figure out what to believe. And so there's been a shift from content to context. Many of us are untrained to think about what are the ways we read contexts. Reference librarians, of course, are skilled at doing this in various kinds of ways. And I'm just saying it's interesting to me that I think we're moving into an era, which, at least speaking for myself, I learn a lot by talking to kids. In fact, I think we're moving into an era of reverse mentorship is as important as mentorship. We both have a lot to learn from each other. And I think that's kind of a key thing as we move forward and how we may reconceive the library in terms of authoritative may need to be remixed itself. But I want to go one step further. I want to extend this blend to say, no, we got Homo sapiens, man who knows, Homo faber, man who makes. I'm going to argue in this exponential age, man, Homo ludens, man who plays. Play may lie at the root of how do we actually unlearn as opposed to just learn. Because we're moving into an era where unlearning is going to become as important as learning. We learned by play originally, and I think we underestimate how much being playful lies at the heart of understanding how to build a new mindset, how to go through a paradigm shift, and so on and so forth. But play is certain types. I mean, if you really look at effective play, look at how we probe the boundaries, how we push things. We see how they respond back, how we're good at inventing rules within a space of rules, or inventing moves within a space of rules, and so on and so forth. What do you think Wall Street is all about? No, I'm not going down there. But this sense of play is a component we haven't thought that much about. And Dale, you see it too. I mean, the way we play with the mechanical leverages and things and how to get the feel for how something is really working. There's something happening here that's becoming now critically important in this world of fluidity, if you wish. And I think what lies at the heart of this triangle is imagination, curiosity, and critically, the sense of agency. Today, kids want to learn, to imagine, but they want to have some effect on the world. agency now is becoming increasingly important as people come in. So I think, how do you wrap up this extended epistemology that really knows how to play off of, make a bad pun, imagination and curiosity, and know how we actually push the rules, how we push the boundaries. And I come out of the world of surfing, I mean real surfing, not web surfing, where everything is pushing boundaries, and likewise World of Warcraft. Let me tell you, you're not a high-performing World of Warcraft if you haven't learned how to probe the boundaries of that system continually, day in and day out. There's a certain sense of looking for the play in a system. Building on that notion of imagination, this is one place I would go a little bit beyond what Walter was saying last night, is we have to now think about a networked imagination. How kids, both in the physical space, in the broader ecosystems, how they're now creating a networked imagination. If you, for example, a serious player of World of Warcraft, you can play with your team around the world. It is astounding to see in the heart of deep play the imagined world that connects these kids together. It is as deep as they're being face to face. I'm particularly interested in, because of Henry Jenkins, the Harry Potter Alliance. The Harry Potter Alliance builds on the fan communities in Harry Potter, leading towards civic imagination, engaging in major global social action, and how they have taken the ability to write and create in the fan world behind Harry Potter to create major social movements around the world, and particularly in Africa right now. So things are going on behind the scenes here. In fact, I'll quote Henry Jenkins here. Are we prepared for students used to creating their own global, collective, intertwined with a networked imagination? Something new is beginning to emerge here. And some of you in your libraries are already sensing this. What are our challenges? We have to expand the notion of literacy. Everyone around this room knows this. How do you move from the traditional to understanding visual, musical, procedural? Very critical. Also underlying the maker movement, et cetera, in cinematic, a field that I'm increasingly more impressed with. And by the way, how do we actually extend these notions of literacy and get our stakeholders to understand that? It's all too easy for our stakeholders to be fixated on the left when basically our real challenges are much to the right. So how do we actually create that kind of understanding? It's also the case that yesterday's, this is now some of the downsides of the exponential age, yesterday's cutting edge is today's dustbin. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of the super cool technology we put in places today, 2 years from now, we should put in the dustbin. Now, here's the problem. How do you, if you're running a major institution, do you justify the CapEx and operating X expenses behind that? Foundations, I might argue, are very good at giving you a single grant. That gets you going really well. It whets your appetite. But basically, that has to be renewed 2 years later. How do you really do that? Most of our institutions and almost all the corporations I work in are unprepared to understand a 2-year amortization path, rather than a 16-year or something like that. So I think there is something here. This kind of rapidity of change also has to do with how do we do staffing challenges, how do we get people to buy into these things, how do we design the renewal campaign as well as the initial setting and so on. So these are some of the darker challenges that lie behind the scenes after we do our beautiful silver ball today. One possible approach to that is how do we create a vision that truly does transform the pace and power of exponential technologies into an adventure and an evolving tool set. And I always come back to don't forget reverse mentorship. But there's something about how do we transform these exponential shifts to a new kind of an adventure, and how do we bring the staff, how do we bring our sponsors, our stakeholders into that adventure around a vision that understands how we can lift, even as that starts to shift. Some of us would call that a meta-narrative, but I think that's going to be a real issue. I think we'll talk about this somewhat today, tomorrow as well. And you might say, how do we do all this stuff? How do we get our institutions to move along with us and get kind of our context to understand this. I'm just going to touch this because I think Michelle's going to go into this much more. My general mantra is, how do you leverage the edge and let the edge pull the core to the edge by creating so much excitement on the edge. I will point out in the corporate world, it's amazing today what we can do on the edge by never asking permission. And that is to say, we simply use our credit card to grab major resources in the cloud computing, try to get something going rapidly, and then show what we've done, and then ask for forgiveness in the monthly bill. But there is something about how do you begin to realize that today, don't go for perfect, just get something that's more of a spiral, so that you can actually show what you've learned. What are the metrics that you can show that? This is kind of the mantra of lean startups as well. But we ought to think seriously about that and how easy it is to start leveraging resources outside of us. I'm going to come back to that. Something that unifies almost all of us here, and Walter last night. How do you think about the library as platform? Instead of thinking about product, how do you shift from product to platform? We are playing the platform game today. And how do we really play that platform today, especially in these exponential ages? There are a lot of interesting possibilities. And I constantly come back to my own work. How do you think about creating, in this ecosystem that Walter was alluding to, a network of partners? Simple little example from Chicago. This is summer learning. This came out of Connected Learning with Connie and the public library downtown. Here, there was active work to build multiple levels of partnerships, from individuals to the library people, to the foundations, to obviously city government, and beyond. And this particular case is very interesting. The role that Lady Gaga actually played in helping to launch a social media campaign for this Summers of Learning that now has been in about 12 different cities around the United States. But it's kind of interesting to say, oh, how do we leverage the social media to help drive our point? They're brand new tools, and you'd be surprised at the ability to get some very high floating people, pardon me, but Lady Gaga, to really take a very active role in how to get today's kids to better understand what the opportunities are here. So I think what we're really up to is how do we kind of think about an architecture of participation with platforms. I'm going to call them pull platforms. And if we look at this, we're embedded now in a complex ecosystem. Museums, schools, home, after school, community sources, libraries of the classical form, all kinds. How do we take that broader ecosystem and look at the edge of each of those components and kind of create an ability to build an infrastructure that starts to pull them together? In fact, the Connected Learning did this with the badge system. The badging actually enabled to be able to get some certain kinds of limited warrants from all the different partners in the ecosystem. But you could never get total buy-in from any one of these partners at large, but you can find their edges. And so it's an edge on an edge play, and think what you can actually do with that. And I really want to say that what I think we're really after is how do we expand the engagement from all these edges around this notion of platform under the vision of what the community library is becoming. So with that, thank you.